Scary Peppa Pig episode that never aired. It was a Wednesday morning when Peppa and George discovered something was terribly wrong with their world. The episode begins with Peppa waking up to find that all the clocks in the house have stopped at exactly 3:33. The silence is deafening. No birds singing. No wind blowing. Just an eerie stillness. When Peppa goes downstairs, she finds Mummy Pig standing motionless in the kitchen, staring at the wall with a blank expression. Her eyes don't blink, and when Peppa calls her name, Mummy Pig's head turns with a mechanical clicking sound. Her smile is too wide, stretching beyond what should be possible, revealing rows of sharp teeth. George appears in the doorway, but something is wrong with his favorite dinosaur toy. Instead of its usual cheerful green color, it has turned a sickly black, and its plastic eyes seem to follow Peppa wherever she moves. When George tries to speak, only static comes out of his mouth, like a broken radio. Daddy Pig emerges from behind his newspaper, but the pages are completely blank except for one headline that reads, "They're watching," in dripping red letters. His glasses reflect not the room around them, but endless corridors filled with shadows that move independently. The family decides to visit Grandpa Pig's house, hoping to escape the strangeness, but the journey becomes a nightmare. The car radio plays the same nursery rhyme backwards, and the roads seem to stretch infinitely. Street signs point to places that don't exist. At Grandpa Pig's house, the garden has transformed into something unrecognizable. The vegetables have grown faces that whisper secrets in languages that hurt to hear. The flowers have wilted into shapes that look like tiny hands reaching up from graves. Grandpa Pig greets them with his usual warmth, but his shadow moves several seconds behind his actual movements. Inside the house, family photographs line the walls, but in every picture, there's an extra figure standing behind the family. A dark silhouette with glowing white eyes that seems to be getting closer with each frame. The television shows only snow, but shapes move within the static. As evening approaches, the whispers begin. They start as barely audible murmurs coming from inside the walls, but gradually grow louder. The voices belong to children, but they're speaking words that no child should know. Peppa realizes that they're not alone in the house. There are other versions of themselves from episodes that were never meant to be aired. These shadow versions watch from mirrors and reflections, their eyes hollow and their smiles twisted. The episode ends with Peppa understanding that there is no escape. The nightmare has become their reality, and somewhere in a television studio, the cameras are still rolling, broadcasting their terror to an audience that doesn't exist. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their bedroom. The toys they had left scattered on the floor were now arranged in a perfect circle, all facing the center where their favorite teddy bear sat motionless. Peppa thought it was odd, but George just giggled and ran to play with his dinosaur. As night fell, the children went to bed as usual. Mummy Pig tucked them in and turned off the lights, but something felt different tonight. The shadows in the room seemed darker, longer, stretching across the walls like reaching fingers. Peppa tried to sleep, but she could hear whispers coming from the toy corner. At first, she thought it was just George talking in his sleep, but when she looked over, her little brother was fast asleep, clutching his dinosaur tightly. The whispers continued, growing clearer. They seemed to be coming from the toys themselves, speaking in voices that sounded almost familiar, yet wrong somehow. Peppa sat up in bed and saw that the toys had moved again. They were no longer in their circle but had formed a line leading toward the bedroom door. The teddy bear that had been in the center was now sitting right beside her bed, its button eyes reflecting the moonlight in an unsettling way. She wanted to wake George, but something told her not to move. The whispers grew louder, and she could make out words now. They were calling her name, but not in the cheerful way her family did. These voices were hollow, echoing as if coming from somewhere far away. The bedroom door slowly creaked open, though no one had touched it. A cold breeze swept through the room, making the curtains dance like ghostly figures. Peppa pulled her blanket up to her chin and watched as more toys began to move on their own, walking in single file out of the room and down the hallway. She could hear them going down the stairs, their tiny footsteps echoing through the house. Then came the sound of the front door opening and closing. Peppa knew she should stay in bed, but curiosity got the better of her. She quietly slipped out from under her covers and tiptoed to the window. Outside in the garden, she saw all the toys gathered in the same circle formation as before, but now they were much larger, almost the size of real people. They stood perfectly still under the pale moonlight, and in the center of their circle was a figure that looked exactly like Peppa herself, but its smile was too wide, its eyes too bright. The figure turned and looked directly up at the window where the real Peppa was watching. It waved with a jerky, unnatural movement, and its mouth opened to reveal rows of sharp teeth that definitely didn't belong in any children's cartoon. Peppa stumbled backward from the window, her heart racing. When she looked again, everything was back to normal. The garden was empty, and her toys were scattered around the bedroom floor just as they had been before dinner. But on her pillow lay a note written in crayon that simply said, "We'll be back tomorrow night to play." From that day forward, Peppa never looked at her toys the same way again. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa discovered something strange in her bedroom. The toys had moved during the night. Teddy was no longer in his usual spot, and her favorite doll was facing the wall. Peppa thought it was odd but went downstairs for breakfast. George was already at the table, but something was different. His cheerful demeanor had been replaced by unsettling silence. He stared at his cereal without eating, his eyes fixed on something that wasn't there. When Peppa tried to talk to him, he only responded with strange whispers that sounded like backwards words. Mummy Pig was cooking in the kitchen, but her movements seemed mechanical. She stirred the same empty pot over and over again. Her smile never left her face, but it had become unnaturally wide. When she turned to look at Peppa, her eyes had become completely black, reflecting nothing. Daddy Pig sat reading the newspaper, but the pages were blank. He turned each empty page with enthusiasm as if reading interesting stories. His glasses reflected shadowy figures moving behind him, even though no one was there. The house began to change. The familiar yellow walls shifted colors, becoming darker. The windows showed a sky that was neither day nor night. The cheerful family photos had transformed. The smiling faces now wore expressions of fear and confusion. Peppa tried to leave, but every door led to the same room. The hallways stretched longer than they should. When she looked outside, the playground was empty, but the swings moved by themselves. The slide had become impossibly tall, reaching into the strange sky. Her friends appeared one by one, but they were different. Susie Sheep's wool had turned gray, and she spoke in multiple voices at once. Rebecca Rabbit's ears drooped unnaturally, and she moved in jerky motions. Pedro Pony's eyes glowed with an inner light that was both fascinating and terrifying. The school bus arrived, driven by someone Peppa didn't recognize. The driver's face was hidden in shadows, and their hands were too long and thin. The other children sat in perfect silence, all facing forward with identical blank expressions. At playgroup, Madame Gazelle sang the same song repeatedly, but the words changed each time, telling stories of children who wandered too far and never returned. The classroom walls were covered with drawings that moved when no one was looking. The muddy puddles Peppa loved had become deep and dark, reflecting something other than the sky. When she jumped in them, she felt like she was falling much further than she should, and the splash echoed for too long. As evening approached, the family gathered for dinner, but the food kept changing. They all ate with mechanical movements, never speaking, never acknowledging anything was different. When bedtime came, Peppa climbed stairs that took her higher than they should. Her bedroom door was at the end of a hallway that stretched forever. Inside, the shadows moved independently of any light source. As she lay down, Peppa could hear her family moving downstairs, but their footsteps sounded wrong, too heavy, too rhythmic, like marching. The sounds continued all night, a constant reminder that nothing was as it should be. The last thing Peppa saw was her reflection in the mirror, but it wasn't moving with her. Her reflection smiled when she frowned, waved when her hands were still, trying to tell her something she couldn't understand. When morning came, everything returned to normal. but Peppa couldn't shake the feeling that the strange night had been more real than the ordinary day that followed. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through their window, and everything seemed normal. But as Peppa turned to wake up George, she noticed something strange. His eyes were completely black, like two dark holes in his pink face. George smiled at her, but it wasn't his usual innocent smile. His teeth had grown sharp and pointed. "Good morning, Peppa," he said in a voice that didn't sound quite right. It was deeper, older, and had an echo that seemed to come from somewhere far away. Peppa felt a chill run down her spine, but she tried to convince herself that she was still dreaming. She rubbed her eyes and looked again, but George's appearance remained the same. His black eyes seemed to stare right through her. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast as usual, but when Peppa entered the kitchen, she gasped. Mummy Pig was humming a haunting melody that made the air feel heavy and cold. When she finally turned around, her face was exactly the same as George's, black eyes and razor-sharp teeth. "Good morning, my dear," Mummy Pig said in that same echoing voice. "Would you like some breakfast?" She held up a plate of what looked like normal bacon and eggs, but the bacon was moving slightly. Daddy Pig appeared in the doorway, and Peppa's heart sank. He too had the same terrifying transformation. The black eyes that seemed to absorb all light, and the menacing smile full of sharp teeth. "What a lovely morning for a family outing," he said. Peppa realized that she was the only one who remained unchanged. She was trapped in her own home with her family, but they were no longer the loving family she knew. They moved differently now, their movements too smooth and coordinated. The house itself began to change around her. The cheerful yellow walls started to fade to a sickly gray color, and the windows grew darker despite the bright morning outside. The familiar furniture seemed to shift and warp when she wasn't looking directly at it. As the day progressed, more characters appeared, each one transformed in the same horrifying way. Susie Sheep arrived with her black eyes gleaming. Pedro Pony's usually friendly neigh had become a bone-chilling sound. They all gathered around Peppa, forming a circle in the living room. Their black eyes never blinked, and their sharp-toothed smiles never faltered. They began to speak in unison. "Join us, Peppa," they chanted. "Become like us." Peppa tried to run, but every door she reached led back to the same room where her transformed family waited. The house had become a maze. As night fell, the transformation of her world was complete. The once bright and cheerful house had become a dark, twisted version of itself. And slowly, inevitably, Peppa began to feel the change starting within herself. Her reflection in the mirror showed the first signs, tiny black specks appearing in her eyes. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa noticed something strange about her bedroom. The familiar yellow walls seemed darker, and the cheerful drawings appeared to be watching her with hollow eyes. George was asleep, clutching his dinosaur toy, but even Mr. Dinosaur looked different. His plastic smile seemed wider, more sinister. Peppa climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The house was unnaturally quiet. Usually she could hear Mummy and Daddy Pig talking downstairs, but tonight there was only silence. Even the wall clock had stopped ticking. As hours passed, Peppa began hearing soft whispers from the walls themselves. The voices sounded like her family, but the words were backwards, in a language she couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder until they filled the entire room. George stirred and opened his eyes, but they weren't the warm brown eyes Peppa knew. They were completely black, like empty holes. He sat up slowly, his movements jerky like a broken puppet. When he spoke, his voice was deeper, older than it should be. The bedroom walls began to shift, the blue paint peeling away to reveal something dark underneath. The furniture started melting into twisted, impossible forms. The bunk bed stretched upward, growing taller until it disappeared into shadows above. Peppa tried calling for her parents, but her voice came out as a whisper. She heard footsteps in the hallway, too heavy to be Mummy's, too slow to be Daddy's. The footsteps stopped outside her door, and the handle began turning with a grinding sound. The door opened, revealing Daddy Pig.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa discovered an old music box in Grandpa Pig's attic. The delicate ballerina inside spun slowly to a haunting melody that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. When Peppa wound the key, the music grew louder, and the walls of the house began to shimmer like water. Suddenly, Peppa found herself in a twisted version of her own home. The yellow walls had turned a sickly green, and the familiar furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs. The family portraits on the walls showed faces she didn't recognize, yet they looked strangely familiar. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she walked through the corridors. George appeared at the top of the stairs, but something was wrong. His usual cheerful expression was replaced by a blank stare, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "The music box knows your name, Peppa." Mummy Pig emerged from the kitchen, but her movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. She smiled too widely, showing teeth that were far too sharp. "Time for dinner, Peppa," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "We've been waiting for you to join us." The dining room table was set for 5, but there were only 4 family members. The 5th chair sat empty, waiting. On each plate was the same meal they had eaten yesterday, and the day before, and every day for what felt like forever. The food never spoiled, never changed, never disappeared. Daddy Pig sat at the head of the table, his glasses reflecting not the room around them, but scenes from Peppa's memories. Happy moments from her past played out in the lenses like tiny television screens. But as she watched, the memories began to change. The smiles became frowns, the laughter turned to whispers, and the bright colors faded to gray. The music box melody continued to play, growing louder and more distorted with each passing moment. Peppa realized that every time the ballerina completed a full turn, something in the house changed. A door would appear where there wasn't one before, or a window would show a different view entirely. She tried to leave, but every door she opened led back to the same dining room. The family sat motionless, waiting for her to take her seat. Their eyes never blinked, their smiles never wavered. The empty chair seemed to pull her toward it with an invisible force. As Peppa approached the table, she noticed that her reflection in Daddy Pig's glasses was different. The Peppa in the reflection was already sitting in the empty chair, already part of this strange family dinner that never ended. The reflection waved at her, beckoning her to join. The music box finally wound down, and in the sudden silence, Peppa heard her own voice coming from the empty chair. "Welcome home, Peppa. We've been waiting for you to remember who you really are." The ballerina in the music box had stopped spinning, but now it was facing Peppa directly, its tiny painted eyes staring right at her. When Peppa blinked, she was sitting in the empty chair, and another version of herself was standing by the music box looking confused and frightened. The cycle was beginning again, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of a music box starting to play. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom, but something felt different today. The sunlight seemed dimmer than usual, and the familiar sounds of birds chirping were strangely absent. Peppa looked around the room. Everything appeared normal, but George was sleeping too peacefully, almost unnaturally still. As Peppa got dressed, she noticed that her reflection in the mirror lagged behind her movements. She waved her hand, and her reflection waved back a moment later. Curious, she moved closer to the mirror. For just an instant, she saw another Peppa on the other side, one with completely black eyes and a smile that stretched too wide across her face. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by eerie silence. When Peppa entered the kitchen, Mummy Pig turned around with her characteristic smile, but her eyes seemed to follow Peppa wherever she moved, never blinking. "Good morning, Peppa," Mummy Pig said in her normal voice, but the words echoed strangely. "Would you like some breakfast?" Peppa sat down at the table. The cereal looked normal, but the milk had turned a peculiar shade of gray. She forced herself to eat, though each bite tasted like nothing at all. George came downstairs dragging his dinosaur toy. but Peppa noticed that his shadow on the wall didn't match his movements. While George walked normally, his shadow danced and twirled independently. When George sat down, his shadow remained standing, swaying like it was listening to music only it could hear. Daddy Pig entered, adjusting his glasses. But today, when light hit his glasses, Peppa could see tiny figures moving inside the lenses, miniature versions of their family, trapped behind the glass, silently screaming and pounding on the surface. "What shall we do today?" Daddy Pig asked, his voice sounding distant, even though he was standing right next to them. Peppa suggested they visit Grandpa Pig, hoping that leaving the house might make everything normal again. But as they prepared to leave, she noticed that all the family photos on the walls had changed. In every picture, their faces had been replaced with blank, featureless ovals. The car ride felt longer than usual. The countryside looked the same, but there were no other cars, no people, no animals. It was as if they were the only living things left. Even the trees seemed to watch them, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. When they arrived at Grandpa Pig's house, everything appeared normal from outside. But when Grandpa Pig opened the door, Peppa gasped. He looked exactly like himself, but he was completely transparent, like a ghost made of glass. She could see right through him to the hallway behind. "Welcome, my dear family," Grandpa Pig said, his voice echoing as if from the bottom of a deep well. "We've been waiting for you for such a long time." As they entered the house, Peppa realized that nothing would ever be quite the same again.